All right. Well, good evening, everyone. And thank you for joining us for this special presentation of the University of Illinois Alumni Association called Stranger Than Fiction, The Story Behind Whalefall. I'm Ryan Ross, the Alumni Association's Director of History and Traditions Programs, Senior Editor of Illinois Alumni Magazine, and Curator and Collections Manager of the Richmond Family Welcome Gallery, the U of I's Heritage Museum, which is located just right out there. I'll be your moderator for this evening's conversation with Daniel Kraus about the inspirations behind Whalefall, the challenges of writing a scientifically accurate novel, and his experience adapting the book into an upcoming movie for 20th Century Studios and Disney. A graduate of the university's iSchool, Kraus is the author of 30 novels and graphic novels, ranging from horror and fantasy to science fiction, thrillers, and books for young adults. Several of his works, including Whalefall, Rotters, and The Death and Life of Zebulon Finch, have been named among the best books of their year by many national publications. In addition to his solo works, Daniel's also a longtime collaborator of iconic filmmakers, such as the Night of the Living Dead director George A. Romero, for whom he completed 2 unfinished novels, as well as Pan's Labyrinth director Guillermo del Toro, with whom he wrote a novelization of the Best Picture Oscar winner The Shape of Water, and the novel Trill Hunters, which was adapted into an Emmy-winning animated series for Netflix. So we'll talk about all of that and more over the next hour or so. And so without further ado, Daniel Kraus.
Thanks.
Okay, so for those of you in the audience who haven't read the book yet, I'm just going to give you a brief-ish synopsis. It's not that brief. Okay, so Whalefall tells an age-old story about the complicated relationship between a father and son. The father, Mick Gardner, is a larger-than-life, tall-tale sort of character, a rugged individualist in his mid-50s, who is more at home on the water than he is the land. He's known in the Monterey Bay area of California as a legendary scuba diver who saved the lives of countless other divers. But to his closest friends and family, he's also known for having no patience for outward displays of emotion, human sensitivities, or opinions that differ from his own. Unfortunately for Mitt, his teenage son Jay is a sensitive boy who seems to take more after his mother than he does his old man. Jay's the target of Mitt's unending criticism, as well as his unending lessons and teachable moments about diving, the ocean, and life in general. A couple years before the story of Whalefall begins, Mitt and the 15-year-old Jay get into a terrible fight, and Jay leaves home to go live with friends. Shortly thereafter, Mitt's diagnosed with cancer, and a year later commits suicide by jumping from a boat into the Pacific Ocean just off the coast of Monastery Beach. Throughout Mitt's illness, Jay refused to come home to see him, and now he's filled with terrible remorse, feeling as though he broke his father's heart and disappointed his mother and his sisters, as well as people in the local community who revered his father. But 17-year-old Jay decides that there is a way to redeem himself by diving into the ocean to recover his father's bones and give them a proper burial, which is exactly the sort of insane idea that a 17-year-old would come up with. But what unfolds is an intense and exciting hero's journey that takes Jay deep inside himself, and after he's accidentally swallowed deep inside the belly of a sperm whale, where he has to fight for his survival. So that's the setup. But it's what Daniel does with the idea, as well as his beautifully vivid descriptions of ocean life and his skill in milking suspense out of the situation, that make this a special book. And that's what we're going to talk about. So, Daniel, to start our conversation, could you talk about where this idea came from? Why did you decide to write a novel about a teenager who gets swallowed by a sperm whale?
Yeah, it's a good question. Just to give me a sense, how many have read the book? Okay, so maybe like half. Often I wouldn't have a good answer for this, but for this book I do have a good answer. And in the afterword of the book, it gets very specific about exactly what day it was, but it was during COVID. I think it was maybe December 2021, maybe? I'm not exactly sure offhand. And I was hanging out with friends outdoors on the banks of Lake Michigan and at night, and they started talking about a viral video that I haven't seen, and undoubtedly some of you have seen it. It's a humpback whale that sort of jumps out and kind of lands on this kayaker, more or less. It's a very startling video, but they were just talking about it, and it just hit me in that moment sort of completely. Could someone really be swallowed by a whale? It's like an idea that obviously exists. It's older than the Bible, this idea. It's one of the oldest concepts of something that we had to worry about when we were early humans, had to be worried about being swallowed by other animals. It was actually a worry. Generally not whales, but you could be eaten. So I was immediately really excited about this idea. And the very next morning, I woke up and I emailed my friend Mary Roach. Now, Mary Roach, some of you may know who that is if you're book people. She's a well-known nonfiction writer who writes books on all sorts of very esoteric, strange topics. And she knows a little bit about everything. So I emailed her and I said, have you ever, in all your weird interviews, encountered anyone who said you could be swallowed by a whale? And she wrote right back and said, yes. She has a book called Gulp, which I had forgotten. I owned it, but I had completely forgotten it. That's all about swallowing, actually. And there's like a page and a half in there where she talks to a whale expert who says that if it were a sperm whale, if it was a big sperm whale and the diver wasn't too big, it was possible. Most whales, and you see these headlines every once in a while, someone swallowed by a whale, never swallowed by a whale. They're mouthed by whales, which is also bad. Don't get me wrong. But those throats are like this. You're not going to be swallowed by anything. Mm-hmm. Sperm whale throats, though, they're like this because they're eating giant and colossal squid all day long. So these giant throats. So she said, yeah, talk to this guy that I talked to. Talk to him. Later that morning, he emailed me back and said, yes, it is theoretically possible. But I'm really a whale behavioralist. You should really talk to this other expert who really understands the throats. Mm-hmm. So I emailed her and said, Phil said to talk to you about the throats. And she said, yes, I can help you out. This sounds great. But who you should really talk to is this other scientist I know who really knows all about stomachs. So within a matter of hours, I had this 3-person team who was really excited by the idea. And were all telling me, yes, this could really happen. So that's where it started.
Okay. We'll circle back to talking about the scientists that you worked with later. But I want to start talking about, really where the book starts with this epigraph from Moby Dick, which is, if this whale be a king, he is a very sulky-looking fellow. Can you talk about why you use that as the epigraph and how Moby Dick and other works served as sort of touchstones for you as you were writing this?
I've probably done 100 Whalefall events, and no one's ever asked me about that quote before.
Yes. It's going to be like this the whole time.
Okay, great. That's what I need. One of the great things about Moby Dick is that it's everything. Mm-hmm. It's an adventure, it's a horror novel, it's a romance in a sense, it's action, it's a comedy, definitely. And so regardless of what kind of book you write, there's a quote waiting for you in Moby Dick. Mm-hmm. At first I said, I don't want to have an epigraph with Moby Dick, it's too obvious. But then I reread Moby Dick and I was like, ugh, there's so many good ones.
I feel like what you just said could be a blurb for Moby Dick.
Yeah, right. They definitely need me to blurb it. But the reason I like that quote is that it's kind of poking fun at the whale a little bit. He's mm-hmm. like, if this whale's a king, he's a sulky-looking fellow. And the book, in some ways, whether the book is talking about the whale or his dad, and one of the developments in the book, and this isn't really a spoiler, is that Jay begins to conflate the two, and he begins talking to the whale as if it's his dad. He's like, he's injured and there's methane. He's kind of losing it. So I like that idea of, there's this whale that's unfathomable and there's this father that's unfathomable, but really they're just beings who have just their own biases and faults, and they're as small as anyone else.
Can sort of along those same kind of touchstone lines, there are many references throughout the book to Cannery Row by John Steinbeck. Mitt talks about it and quotes from it all the time, like it's scripture. Though Jay points out that Mitt doesn't really read any other books, just Cannery Row, over and over and over again. And it struck me that Mitt is this specific type of kind of hyper-local person who couldn't really exist anywhere else other than the Monterey Bay area or areas exactly like it. And Cannery Row is kind of like Mitt in that way, in that it's a product of his place. So can you talk about why you decided to make Cannery Row such a huge part of this?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly wasn't a plan at the beginning, but when I was trying to figure out where to set the book, I actually talked to one of these people who was in the mouth of a whale, and he was like, I worked once with this diver in Monterey Bay. His name's Connor. You should get with him. He can answer a lot of your scuba diving questions. So in talking to Connor, I was like, do you know where I should set this book? I want it to be in America somewhere where there'd be sperm whales that are sort of close to the coast. He said, yeah, you should set it right here in Monterey, specifically this beach called Monastery Beach, which is, I went out and visited, very dramatic, small beach that's often considered the most dangerous beach in America. They call it Mortuary Beach because so many people die there. So when I was there, I walked around Monterey, and when you walk around Monterey, you just see John Steinbeck's just everywhere. That quickly became apparent that specifically Cannery Row, because the main drag in Monterey is Cannery Row. All the old cannery factories, the ruins of them are all right there. So when I visit places that I write about, I really like to kind of soak in those details and use them if possible. So it seemed like it was grist for the mill to pick up on what would be sort of the local Bible,
Sure.
That's not the Bible. And that works into the character of Mitt, who's stringently non-religious, but I would posit that he's the most religious person in the book. It's just that he has a different way of looking at it. His Bible is Cannery Row.
Sure.
His angels are the whales and the sea creatures. He finds his awe not in the church but in the ocean.
There's this part of the book where Mitt is talking about it's when he has his boat that he's the whale guide tours, and he's talking about how these the people who come on these tours, they want to be awed by something, but really they just want to take pictures for social media, and he has contempt for them. But the fact that it made me think of it because you were talking about how he has this sort of awe for the ocean and everything related to it, and he wants other people to experience that, and then when they don't experience it in the same way as them, he just doesn't have. He just wants to kick them to the side.
Yeah, he acts like someone who's in church and it gets mad at their kids who aren't paying attention.
Yeah, like these people are blaspheming because they're not actually.
They'll come to whatever kind of religion or spirituality they want to in their own time, in their own spaces.
Yeah, sure.
Like Mitt is covered with tattoos, and those are his version of wearing like rosary beads or whatever. So when he sees people Mitt is always losing his job and having to come up with new odd jobs, so he has a whale watching boat for a while. And so when he sees people just taking selfies and not paying attention to this place he considers holy, he gets angry about it,
I'm going to pivot a little bit to talking about Mitt and Jay's relationship. So you have this really high concept idea going on in this book, but then there's also this central relationship that really reveals two main themes of the book, which are the idea of control in relationships and an emotionally abused person finally asserting their own agency. So for most of Jay's life, he's lived under the thumb of his domineering father, who had a much stronger personality and then tried to impose it on Jay, as if he were trying to make Jay more like him. And there are dozens of examples in the book of Jay, of Mitt being openly critical, calling Jay a mistake, humiliating him because of his masculinity, his sensitivity, his weight, his weak lungs, basically everything that Jay is that Mitt isn't. And so when Jay decides to leave home after they get into a fight on the boat, he's making a change that he feels like he has to make. And it's important because it's really the first time in Jay's life that he has asserted his own agency against his father. And then after Mitt gets cancer and Jay decides not to come home, he's still asserting his own agency, even though it's hurtful and misguided. And then when he decides to make this insane dive, he's still just trying to prove that he's his own person and that he has the ability to make things right. And so it struck me that the power dynamic between the two of them is similar to the power dynamics in a lot of emotionally abusive relationships. And I'm just wondering if you could talk about why you decided to make a relationship like theirs the central relationship in the book.
Yeah, because it really could have been anyone in there, right? So that it was totally up for grabs. In some ways, the beginning of that relationship started with the biology of the whale, oddly enough. The first thing I learned about the whale was that its throat was this big, but that's not that big. And so the experts were telling me it'd have to be somebody who was kind of small, someone who was pretty skinny. And so my first thought was maybe someone who's just young, a lanky kid. As soon as I thought that, I said, okay, so what's the most powerful relationship a kid probably has? A teenager. I was like, well, it's probably a parent. So I said, okay, we've got a diver and we've got a parent. And I mean, things start clicking then, once you think about that. And then certain metaphors started just presenting themselves to me, like this parent who was in some ways like a whale, who was this larger than life, unfathomable thing that Mitt in life sort of ate Jay alive. Like Jay was nothing in Mitt's shadow. So this could be a kind of physicalization of that idea.
Yeah.
Like now he's being literally eaten alive by this being who represents Mitt. Like you said, there's a kind of a power shift happening where, one person he's not trying to impress in finding the bones is his dad. He's really doing it to get his sisters off his back, to convince his mom that he's not, a piece of crap, and just to feel like he's kind of tough and he can do it.
Yeah, and to get other divers to stop spitting on him.
Yeah, because they all thought Mitt was the best.
Yeah.
They didn't know how Mitt was to him and what he was like at home. And you're right, he was emotionally abusive to Jay in some respects. But the book is in two halves, really. And the first half is called Truth, and the second half is called Mercy. And those are, things that are taken from my reading of the book of Jonah. And I guess the idea being that there is, before he gets swallowed by a whale, there are facts, right? There is the truth about these things that his dad did to him and the way they interacted. I think you could pretty much come down that he was worse than Jay because he is the adult. But, Jay also just never visited him when he was dying. And so that, he might have some regrets too. And so the mercy part of it is knowing what we know about how bad they were to each other, granted the dad worse than him, can they find a way? Can he find a way to forgive his dad anyway? Can he find mercy despite the truth, despite the fact that it's unjust?
Sure.
And that's the only way he's getting out of this whale, is to somehow come to terms with his father, which will then unlock all the lessons that he taught Jay about the ocean and whales and all these tips that, if he can remember them, could get him out of this whale.
Yeah, right. That dovetails nicely with my next question, which is about the imagined conversation that the two of them have when Jay's inside the whale. And almost everything that Jay does to try to stay alive is motivated by a memory that he has of something he learned from Mitt. And it becomes clear while you're reading it that Mitt has always been the voice in Jay's head, for better or worse, and will continue to be. The lifetime of criticism that he's received from Mitt is up there in his head, but so is everything else that Mitt taught him about diving and the ocean and life in general. And the way you structure the book with the alternating chapters between Jay's dive in the present and then his memories throughout his life, it was a brilliant way to tell the story, because it allowed you to keep a fast pace with the main action, which takes place over the course of only 90 minutes. And then in the alternating chapters with the memories, you can see all of these things that have happened to Jay over the past 17 years, and how everything that's happened to him has been really preparing him for this experience.
Yeah.
And so can you talk about why you decided to structure it that way?
Again, just like the choice to have a teenager was based on physiology of the whale, the choice to have the short chapters was based on a practical concern at first, which was, I had this idea that the chapter titles was going to be his PSI, so how much air he has left in his tank. And it was just going to tick down, tick down, tick down. And I really liked that. And I said, I really want to see that as often as I can.
It's inherently suspenseful.
Yeah, I want the reader to see those numbers. So I thought, well, maybe the chapters should be short.
Yeah.
I never really had written a book with really short chapters before. They're generally 2 pages. Some of them are 1 sentence. It moves very fast. And then, as sort of a bonus, so you'll have a PSI rating, and then it'll be like, 2011, and then PSI rating, then 2018. It jumps all over the place. But the effect that created of this turning the pages is that it felt like you were strangulating. It felt like every time that you had a flashback, you were like, you had a gasp of breath.
Yeah.
And so I found that the format of the book was putting you in the physical state of the main character, which I thought was really neat and really interesting. And then as a bonus, allowed me this like wild freedom, which is actually a bad thing when you're writing, not a good thing, but this freedom to do almost anything with my flashbacks. Like I could go any which way, which was great in one sense, but when you have no limits, it's actually a disaster in some ways. So that was what's behind it.
Well, it really keeps you turning the pages in a way that kind of like how Vonnegut uses all these short chapters, and structuring things in that way makes you go like, I'll just read one more page, and then the next thing you know, you've read like 30 pages.
Yeah, it has a weird effect like that.
Yeah, it does. Like you think, this is so digestible, I'm just going to keep going, and then you read the whole thing in one sitting.
Digestible.
Yes.
Very good.
Somebody do a rim shot for me. So earlier you were talking a little bit about some of the scientists who you were talking to, and in your acknowledgments, you write about these marine biologists and also divers who helped you make the story scientifically accurate. And the fact that you committed to this scientific accuracy, I think, is one of the reasons why you have this insane premise that seems completely believable while you're reading the book. And so can you talk about what your collaborative process was with these scientists and other specialists?
Yeah, I mean, typically, I always do a lot of research. I love research. I usually have the basic kind of beats for the story, but it's really when I get into the research that the story really evolves, because that's where you find all the cool stuff. They're like, oh, I could do this, and this could happen. This is how a character could be that kind of person. I couldn't do any of that with this one, because I don't know anything about whale. I didn't know anything about it. I can't stress that enough. So how could I begin to even plot what could happen inside of a whale? I don't even know how big the stomach is. Is it like Pinocchio? You can just wander around? Is it, So I front-loaded all the research. And for a thing where you're on a 60-minute time limit, because once he's in the whale, he's got 60 minutes of air left. Every second has to be accounted for. So this book needed to be very carefully plotted out and outlined. This wasn't just a sit down and just right away. It had to be very, very carefully created. So I spent 3 months basically just talking to these whale experts and doing lots of interviews because I didn't know anything. So it was like being in college and having a class in advanced whale, basically. And starting with the simplest questions. How big is the stomach? They would be like, well, there's 4 stomachs. Like, oh, okay. How big is the first stomach? What does it feel like? How hot is it? What does it smell like? How much water is there in it? And just arduously, it was almost like I was in the stomach with a flashlight and pointing it around, saying, "What's that? What's that?" Very slowly, kind of learn the architecture of what's going on in there, and the scientists were really into it because they talk about. I mean, their life is in whale guts, but they never get to think about it from this angle.
Yeah.
Like no one's ever asked them what the temperature is in there. Like why would they? And so it was kind of fun for them to have someone ask questions that they never get asked. What would happen if you stabbed it from the inside? What would happen if you tried to climb up the throat? All these, what happens if you go through into the second stomach? Like all these very practical concerns of like Jay as a sort of interior parasite. And then there was questions for the diver, which was mostly Connor, but I had other experts too. But and I did go. I'm not a water guy. Grew up in Iowa. I don't know anything about oceans either. But I did go scuba diving to sort of learn, not to become a master scuba diver, but just to learn more viscerally what it felt like. How heavy are the tanks? How does it sound when you're breathing through the regulator and the mask? And visited the site. So I tried to do everything. I just wasn't. If the first expert had told me no, you can't fit down any throats, I would have not done the book. It's again with Jonah and Pinocchio, and I mean it's been done fantastically before.
Sure.
It's not easy, but it's like that's out there.
Yeah.
But has the idea of having to do it realistically, like The Martian or something, like
sure,
where you have to hew to reality, was very exciting to me. And working with the experts, it was we would have these moments where to them they were just giving another answer, but to me it was like head blowing open. It was like, well, you could do this if you had. I'd be like, what? That's how he's going to do this, and
yeah.
So it was really it was hard but fun. There were a couple pieces of anatomy that I just could not figure out, and we would have like 2-hour Zooms where I would just be. I'm being vague because I don't want to spoil it for anyone, but just couldn't wrap my head around. Despite having all these books of like gross whale anatomy, I just couldn't figure it out. So I'd sort of act it out in front of the camera, and she would say, "No, it's more like this."
That sounds like a blast.
It was fun. It was hard, but it was fun. And then once that was done, although I had questions along the way, once it was outlined, then I could just sort of write it more or less like a normal book.
Have you gotten to do any events like this with some of those scientists?
No, I really wanted to. I've met tons of scuba divers though, and I don't want to brag, but I think I nailed it. Like the scuba divers have all been happy.
What more can you ask for, really? I mean, the fact that you, it just...
I did do a scuba diving club. I did one scuba diving club, yeah.
That's awesome. So one of the other things that you talk about in your acknowledgments is the fact that, you tried to make it scientifically realistic as much as possible, but occasionally you had to use artistic license because there are some things that are just not known to science. So can you talk about some of the scenes where you did use that license and the challenges or pressures that you felt to make these things seem, plausible?
One thing the scientists were always telling me was, we're giving you our best guesses here. No one's been inside a whale. It's impossible to send like a camera down a whale throat while it's alive. The only time you can study a sperm whale is when beaches, and then you've got like 24 hours, like a bat signal goes out and all the whale scientists show up.
Yeah.
And then you have to move very quickly. You can't even get through blubber in 24 hours. You cannot hack your way through a whale unless you're with the Inuits, but they have special techniques. I'm sort of getting far afield here. Question was
the question.
Pressure. Was the pressure to get right. Yeah.
In what it was a two-parter. Part one was, what were some of the scenes where you did use the license?
So they were always telling me.
Yeah.
They were always trying to reassure me. Look, these are our best guesses. So even if you get it a little wrong, we're the experts and we won't even know. It's like there's a little wiggle room in there. And there's one thing in particular that I don't think I want to talk about specifically because it's a spoiler.
Okay.
But I do reference it in the author's note at the end, where there's one attribute I give the whale that's at least, I don't want to say it's controversial really, but it's like it's not entirely agreed upon. Some whale scientists think that this is a thing that whales can do, and some don't. They're leaning towards the yes, but my scientists thought yes, and it worked so well for the book that I went with yes.
Okay.
But I admit it, that it's like this one's a little up for grabs.
Sure. Okay. And then, so did you feel any sort of pressure? I mean, even if I guess the whale experts are saying like, do whatever, we're not going to challenge you. But
I wouldn't go that
within
far.
reason. Within reason.
Yeah. They would give me a little wiggle room. It's like,
sure.
Let's not do it right.
Okay. I'm going to pivot a little bit here and ask you about, so Mitt's cancer battle is set during the pandemic. And so if Jay hadn't left home when he did, he would have essentially been trapped in a house with Mitt during his entire illness. So you could have set the story at any time. So why did you choose to set it during the pandemic like this?
Well, during the pandemic, I was actually working on a different book of mine called The Ghost That Ate Us. And that one was very fixed to actual historical dates. And so when the pandemic happened, I couldn't, there was no wiggle room with my dates. I had to rewrite it with the pandemic in mind. And my first instinct, as I think most people's would be like, can I just nudge it so I don't have to deal with it? But I did deal with it, and I was just astounded by how much better it made the book. Like it felt so much more specific and rich, and how everyone reacted to the pandemic, told you things about them, and I just really liked it. I like just, and the pandemic is like World War II. You're like, it's not going to fall off that, in 30 years, no one's going to pick this up and say, what pandemic?
Yeah, right.
They're going to remember it.
Sure.
So it's like, you might as well start incorporating it into the book because it's a massive global event. So I just did the same here. I just said, this is what's happening right now while I'm writing this. And again, I found it just enriched what was happening. You wouldn't, read a book that takes place during World War II, even if it's on the home front and had nothing to do with the war, they're going to reference the war.
Sure.
Because it's all around you, even if you're nowhere near it.
It's just pervasive.
And so I just found it just made the book more interesting.
Yeah, most definitely. And it makes the fact that that Jay doesn't come home and that he's gone for that whole period just seem even worse.
Yeah, there's certainly a demoralization to it. You know, like he's living on with his friend's sofa, and stuff, and he's not getting to go to school, and it's
which
another pressure.
All of that really just raises the stakes of the dive that he's making.
Yeah.
So, good choice.
Thank you.
Now I'm going to ask you a few questions about. We're doing fine on time. I'm going to ask you a few questions about Jay being in the whale. So after he gets trapped inside the whale, he gets a giant squid's beak stuck in his hand.
Yes.
And ultimately ends up using it as a cutting tool, kind of a lot like a diver's knife. You talk about how you got that idea?
Yeah, I'm forgetting the stat, but so sperm whales eat squid all day long, just constantly. And the squids are gelatinous. I mean, they're huge, bigger than this table, much bigger in some cases, but they can be squished down to a trunk. They're, gelatinous, with one exception. At their center, about the size of maybe a little baseball sized, are these beaks. And these beaks are the opposite of the rest of them. They're diamond hard and can cut almost anything. They're tougher than almost any known steel. They're incredible. And they're the one thing the whale can't digest. So their stomachs are filled with whale beaks. Some whales have been found to have, it's I don't remember, it's in the book somewhere, I don't know if it's 4,000 or 8,000, but like massive amounts of these beaks. So a lot of these beaks end up in stomach 2, and that's where Jay goes at one point. He goes in the stomach 2, which is, stomach 1 is bad, stomach 2 is way bad. Stomach 2 is where the acid is. So he doesn't spend very long in there because the wetsuit will protect you from the acids for a while, but it will eventually dissolve you. And it's really hellish. It's sort of a neon bowl of goo, basically, melted squid. Yeah, you can see in the whale, by the way, for those who haven't read the book, because there's bioluminescence everywhere, so you can actually see what's happening, which is debatable whether that's good or not. But so yeah, he gets one of these beaks stuck in his hand. It just felt to me that the most obvious object inside of a sperm whale is going to be a whale beak. So,
Makes sense.
I always thought of that scene in Jaws where they cut open the smaller shark, and there's like a license plate, boot, and all these things that the shark is eating. It's the same thing with the whale. Like, they're eating all day, and they eat a lot of junk. Like, a lot of whale deaths are because they ingest so much plastic. And plastic bags look like jellyfish, so they just eat so much junk. And so anyone who would end up in a sperm whale is going to find themselves surrounded by some junk. And that's going to be your tool set. Like, all right, at some point, Jay's going to have to look at the stuff that's in there and say, what do I have? And he has a squid beak, and then, maybe 4 or 5 other pieces of junk. And what can he MacGyver out of that,
Right. That's my 2 questions from now. I actually call him a teenage MacGyver. And we'll get to that, though. So the beak, in a very short amount of time, he gets very attached to it. It even gives it a nickname. He starts calling it Beaky. And it occurred to me that the way that he relates to Beaky is similar to the way that the Tom Hanks character in the movie Castaway relates to Wilson the volleyball. And both are examples of the kinds of things that people latch onto to make meaning in situations where they're isolated or hopeless. And so I wonder if you could talk about that idea, and also what the challenge was of writing this book where the main action really only has one human character.
Yeah. That was the big challenge, is there's one, kind of the flashbacks, but there's one character that's inside another being that is so big that it has no idea that Jay's even in there. it would never swallow Jay on purpose. Jay gets swallowed because he gets entangled with a squid, and the squid gets swallowed and pulls Jay in. So it's not even the squid. The whale is like a god. It's like, if you're thinking about the inside of the whale as this like hell, that's sort of true for the second stomach, but that's not really how it feels in the book. It's more like he's been swallowed by a god of some sort, and it's the size difference is so massive that he means nothing to the whale. Like he's until he starts causing chaos in there, the whale has no idea he's even really in there. So yeah, that was the challenge. Is who's he going to talk to? You know, is this whole book going to be in his head? Yeah. And a lot of it is. But I always knew that there was going to be a point where he would begin to talk to the whale, his whale/dad.
Sure.
But in the meantime, you know, he's going to resist that for a while. He's going to resist any kind of a reconciliation with his dad. And so I wanted there to be a kind of teammate that he had, that he could say, I don't need my dad. I've got you, Beaky.
Yeah.
And it is kind of like the Wilson in Castaway. Like, he just becomes really attached to it because he has got nothing else. When you have no other friend, your best friend is a rock. You know? Like, and he's got no friend here, so his best friend is a beak. And he becomes very attached to it, and it becomes kind of like in Castaway, which is another one-hander with only really one character. You sort of go with them on it, like, and you become attached to this beak as well, which at least has the benefit of having once been part of something that was alive, even though it tried to kill him.
That's right. You got to pick your friends where you can find them, I guess.
Slim pickings in there.
Yeah. So what you were saying just a second ago about him being sort of a MacGyver kind of figure, finding what he can in the whale's stomach and then figuring out, you know, how to survive with these things, including, well, you can just read the book. I was going to say something and I'm not going to. But can you talk about what your process was like for deciding what kinds of objects would be in the whale's stomach? And if you had any inspirations from other movies or books?
I mean, just the one from Jaws, like I said, when I put the stuff out, that made sense to me even before I learned about all the stuff that whales are always swallowing, which really runs the gamut too. Amazing things. It was really a process of working backwards. You know, like, I had to figure out how the book was going to end and figure out what are the things that Jay's going to need to know to have a shot to get out, and sort of reverse engineer how could he have learned about some of those things from his dad. What tools would he need to pull off some of those actions, and find ways to put those very, very, very few objects in there in ways that will be a surprise. You won't guess how they're going to be used, and seed those ideas in the flashbacks in ways that feel natural, and you won't know that I dropped some important piece of information until he thinks of it. So it was just like one of those complicated setting up of, you know, conservation of elements was the principle they call it, where you introduce a number of elements, and those are all going to come into play before the end of the story.
Right. I read this book 3 times in preparation for this, and the second and third readings, I was able to go, oh, I see what you're doing here.
Yeah.
In a way that I definitely didn't the first time around. But when a while back I interviewed you for the Alumni magazine, and you were talking about this idea of using what he has in terms of that scene in Apollo 13.
Oh, yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Oh, yeah. There's a scene in Apollo 13, which I haven't seen since it first came out. So I don't remember it very well, but I remember this great moment where it's back down on Earth, probably in Houston, I guess, and one of the guys, I don't remember who plays him.
In Mission Control.
Mission Control.
Yeah.
Says, okay, the guys up there who are up in space have to take this this end to their capsule and have to connect it to this end of this other thing. And here's everything that's in their capsule, and he dumps it on the table. And so we have to find a way to connect those two with the tools that we have. So that, again, is similar, better than the Jaws example of here's what we got, how do we make it work?
And that's really, that's one of the most interesting aspects of the book, is seeing how Jay uses all of these things to try to find a way out.
Yeah, and in another sense, like being in a whale in an ocean is a lot like being in a capsule in space.
Yeah,
it's very
totally.
similar.
It's very good.
They're going different directions, but you're isolated in the same way within unfathomable darkness.
Yes. An abyss.
Yeah.
Okay. So at one point you defined the concept of a whalefall, and once you did, it struck me that Mitt's suicide is its own kind of whalefall.
Yep.
Could you talk about what a whalefall is and how Mitt's death serves as a metaphor for that?
Yeah. So I mean, I think this is a term that a lot of people know, but I didn't know actually until I was working on the outline for the book, and I came across it. So for those of you who don't, whale falls when a whale dies and sinks to the bottom of the ocean, so the very deepest abyssal zones, I think they're called. And the death, once it reaches the bottom, essentially creates a shock wave of life that continues for generations, hundreds of years. Hundreds of years of life are created and spawned by this dead thing. So in a way, it's like, on the one hand, it's a decomposing body, but on the other hand, it's this incredible, one of the greatest metaphors I've ever run across, how one person's death can impact generations. And I thought that was just wonderful. And yeah, so Mitt, you could say, you can have different opinions on whether he should have thrown himself off the boat or not, but his death, his whalefall essentially is Mitt, is Jay, is his sisters. Like they are the after effects of their father.
Sure.
And it just, anytime I talk about that, I get goosebumps. There's something about this idea that I just find very, very powerful. My sister died the week that Whalefall came out.
Oh.
And the whole week I was on tour, I was checking in with her husband. She had cancer. I was checking in with her husband all week, like saying, "Do I need to come there now?" And when I started the tour, it was like she's got a few months, and then a weekend it was like she's got a few weeks. A few days later, it's like she's got a few days, and then it's like it was just like escalating massively. So that's another thing that has just like imprinted it on my mind. Like while this book was coming out and I was on tour with it, I was just constantly thinking. I was also dealing with this impending death. That when I spoke at her funeral a few weeks later, I talked about whale falls. Like it's the idea has touched me in such a way that I'm always thinking about it in those terms now. Like, everyone at their funeral, I was telling them, her name was Jenny. We're all Jenny's whalefall now. She has died, and we're all here because we've all been affected by her. And there's something really kind of beautiful about that.
Yeah, that's gorgeous. For the next few minutes, we're going to branch out a little bit and talk about other aspects of your career, and then we'll wind back to Whalefall at the end. So as a transition question, earlier you were starting to talk a little bit about the research that you do for your books and how it was different for Whalefall. You talk a little bit about what your research process is usually like?
Well, it changes per book, but it's never before I had gone into a book knowing nothing. Like I can't even plot this book. I don't know. I know how the book starts, and that's it. So usually it's much more how you'd expect. It's an idea. like I just finished this book on, just literally turned it in yesterday. This book that's set in World War I.
Wow.
So that's a much more like typical example of I think I know what I want to happen, roughly plot it out with the major beats, and then go into the research, which will take away some of those beats. It will replace a lot of them. It will tell me who all the characters should really be. I might have had some sense, but I'm usually wrong, and they're much more like these other people that I find during the research. You watch your documentaries. I'm not going to talk to anyone who lived in World War I. They don't exist anymore, really. But if it was a more recent war, I would try to talk to people who were actually there. And then you do most of the research before I start, and then as needed as we go. There's always something that pops up.
So a lot of your work falls into the umbrella of speculative fiction, horror, science fiction, thrillers, etc. What can you talk about what appeals to you, both as a writer and as a fan, for those kinds of genres?
Yeah, I mean, I've written almost every genre at this point. I haven't done a Western, but I've got one coming. I haven't done, there's something else I haven't done. I mean, Shape of Water was a romance, so I mean, I've done that. But I read and I watch every genre. I really am omnivorous. Like, it doesn't matter if I like romance books, I like thriller books, I like nonfiction, everything. And that's how I try to write. I try to just take wild left turns. I'm an agent's nightmare because I just keep changing when I'm writing, which is...
And they don't know how to market you?
Well, I mean, the cliche really is true that, once you've written a book that people like, they really do want you to write that book over and over.
Sure.
So I don't at all. And I think in the short run, that's really bad. Like, you will lose readers. They'll get confused. Why are you writing this entirely different genre? That's nothing like the book we like. But in the long run, since I'm approaching 30 books here, in the long run, it's good. If you can make your brand that you don't have a brand, which I think I've finally gotten there, that's really good because it frees you up and people will start following you because of something in the heart of the writer that's not sort of all the things that are surrounding it. And that's hard to get to. And an easier career path would just be the other way.
Sure.
Just kind of stay in your lane, kind of. So yeah, I mean, I guess most of my books would be speculative, but certainly not all of them. I feel like half my books are just realism, with no edge of any supernatural. So I think that's up for debate, I think. I don't know that there's anything particular about speculative fiction that draws me. I think when I was growing up as a little kid, if there's any genre that speaks to me in a special way, it's horror. Yeah. Because as a little kid, I was a very small, skinny little kid, like in middle school and stuff. Smallest kid in middle school, and that was tough. As a guy, a small guy, I was sort of a target, and I really turned to horror in a big way. That I felt like horror watching this was the VHS era. So and they would just stock anything. Like, they had no idea what they were ordering in those stores. Like, you get Faces of Death at your grocery store. That's like a snuff movie. They had that at the grocery store. It's insane. It's crazy times. But I turned to horror as sort of like, I think, armor to sort of make myself tougher in a way. Like, maybe the bullies at school were bigger, but they couldn't watch what I watch. They couldn't take the stuff that I was feeding myself at night.
It would melt their brains.
It'd melt the brains. So I always have a little soft spot for horror. And I think all my books, almost all of them, have some touch of horror in it. Sure. And some of them are just full-bore horror.
Yeah. So in addition to the solo books you've written, you've also collaborated with iconic horror directors like George Romero and Del Toro. wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you got linked up with the two of them working, and what your working relationships are like,
Yeah,
have been like.
and I've done a couple other collaborations too. It's there. I mean, every collaboration is wildly different. You're dealing with just different personalities. Or in the case of George Amiro, who had recently died when I started on his work, he's not even there. And so I have to figure out a way to sort of represent him in a way. But the commonality is that there's some friction, and that's good. You don't want too much. You don't want people who hate each other. But the whole point to me to collaborate would be to push myself. It's the same reason I keep changing genres and keep changing formats and tense styles and everything so radically, is I want to not ever write the same book. I want to force myself to relearn how to write a novel every single time. And a good way to do that is collaborate, because they're just not going to be like you. And they're going to have their druthers on certain things, and you're going to butt heads, and you have to figure out a way into other people's ideas that you can figure out a way to something that you love inside someone else's idea, and vice versa. And so that's always the exciting part for me, is like to push myself to do something that I wouldn't regularly do. The working relationships are, they just are unpredictable. You know, like some of them are exactly what you're imagining, where it's like, I read a chapter, they revised the chapter, they read a chapter, you know, other ones are completely different, where it's like, you know, the Ramiro books, he wrote what he wrote, he left notes or he didn't, and I have to puzzle it out, like, and create the bridges between the islands that he built.
And try to do it in a spirit.
Yeah, and try to learn as much about him so I would understand what he would have thought about any weird turns that I want to make. So it's really specific to the person.
Gotcha. And how did you begin working with Del Toro?
It's pretty simple, really. He had read my second book, which is called Rotters.
Okay.
And he just really liked it. And at the time, it was just a lucky timing, I think. He had this book that he was on contract to write but hadn't written, called Troll Hunters. And he was looking for a co-author. And I think he just read Rotters and liked it, and was like, reached out to my agent. And that's where that relationship started, yeah.
I see. So you started your career as a filmmaker, and then after you went to library school here, you started publishing novels. Can you talk about the differences in how you have approached those two creative mediums and which you prefer and why?
Yeah, I used to get asked this all the time, because I was closer to my filmmaking career, where I largely directed documentaries. Now that I'm kind of further away from that period, I don't get asked this much anymore. But I can tell you my answer was always, I have no idea. Like, they seemed so radically different that I would try to figure out ways that they were the same.
Were your research processes the same?
No, they just weren't the same at all. The only thing I can think of is that my favorite part of filmmaking was always editing. And I feel like there's some commonality there. Like, my favorite part of writing is after I finish the first draft and I do my own draft, that's easily my favorite part.
Yeah.
Because that's where I'm going in and just making sentences pretty. And
Sure.
That's a good time. And that feels to me, like, emotionally, it feels like editing a movie, where you've got all this junk and you're just finding ways to make it pretty in a way.
So now you're sort of combining these two things by adapting Whalefall into a movie for 20th Century Studios and Disney. Can you talk about what challenges you've run into in trying to adapt the book into a screenplay?
Yeah, I will say I can say very little.
Sure.
There's a lot I could say, and I can't say any of it. So I have to speak in generalities here. I will say that in some ways, the book is metal proof. Not metal as in MEDDLE. Like, the stuff that's in the whale, like, I exhausted what you can do inside of a whale.
Yeah.
So it's not like a producer can say, well, how about if he does this? He can't. I've done everything you can do. So the stuff that takes place in the whale, I can say, transfers over pretty one-to-one. It's pretty exact. The challenge is really everything else, because there might be 50 little flashbacks in the book.
Sure.
But in the movie, you're probably going to get 5 or 6, you know? So it's going to be a little harder to figure out how to get all the stuff you were getting from all those flashbacks, both practically to set up the end game and emotionally in vastly fewer scenes.
Sure.
So that was the bigger challenge, I think.
Yeah, that sounds like that's quite an undertaking.
We figured it out.
Okay, well, that's good. That's reassuring. When does the movie come out? Any idea?
No.
Okay.
I'll just say it's going well.
Good.
Everything's going well.
What aspects, if you can say, what aspects of the book are you most excited to see on screen?
Well, I mean, I think everyone involved, you know, it was curious / excited / worried about just how do we do that? How do we do the stomach? What is this? You have a living set, a set that's moving and breathing, and the first stomach is how a whale chews. So it's got to be a stomach that can constrict, and it has to be able to move 360 degrees. And at one point, there's a squid in there attacking Jay, and there's certain differing amounts of seawater, and there's water and fish and squid coming in and jellyfish coming in and out of the stomach. So how do you do all this?
Yeah.
And have an actor be safe inside there. And
Are they doing it practically?
I think I can say we're doing it practically.
Okay, that's exciting. That's the one thing that my kids always ask about anything. Is it practical?
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah,
I'm glad to hear that.
They'll be stoked.
So that was probably the biggest. We have. Everything's gonna work, but it was fun to see. It was fun to see the people who are making it work. God, I sound like an idiot being so vague. But it was really cool to see the people who are really good at this stuff. And almost in like a week, we're like, well, here's how we're going to do it. And everyone was just like, oh, okay, great. Now we get it. We can do this. Yeah.
All right. Well, that's very exciting.
Yeah, it's neat.
I have, let's see here. Okay. We got one non-Whalefall question for you, then one more Whalefall question, and then we will be wrapping up. Okay, so if you could have a dinner party with any 5 writers or filmmakers, living or dead, who would they be?
See, this is where I should have known the questions.
I offered to send him the questions, and he said, let's not do that.
Yeah, I can't answer this one. So you're saying filmmakers or writers, huh? I'd like to ask Mary Shelley some questions. What was really going on at that house?
That's right. Is the story the real story?
Yeah, like there's a lot of weird stories about what went on there. I'd like the straight dope on that. Honestly, although I had met George Romero in life, it was the honor of who's my favorite artist in any medium. It was the honor of my career to work on the George Romero books. To be able to sit down with him and with a lot of nervousness and say, what did you think about what I did? I don't think I could say no to that. Because he's someone I miss. I don't know, I feel like I'm just listing people I like now.
That's fine.
I mean, my other biggest influence growing up was George Romero and Rod Serling. I don't know that I really have any specific questions to Rod Serling.
I don't know. I also think that Rod Serling would not be a good dinner guest because you would just chain smoke the entire time.
So much smoke. But so would Romero.
I feel like
actually, this is a horrible.
I mean,
dinner.
you're not really having dinner just to have dinner. It's for the company.
I'm going to change all my answers. It's just me and Mary Shelley. No one else is invited.
That's right. Yeah. I think that Mary Shelley would have the propriety to not chain smoke during your dinner.
Yes.
Although maybe she would. I don't know. Okay, so my last question about Whalefall. So Jay goes through this horribly traumatic, one-of-a-kind experience. and reaches this place of forgiveness and understanding for Mitt that he couldn't achieve while Mitt was still alive. And it feels like the book ultimately serves as a testament to all the things that Jay learned from his father. And reading it, it seems like more than anything else that Whalefall is a book about processing grief.
Yeah.
And so why did you want to write about that?
And not necessarily grief of someone being dead, although that could be part of it. Just grief of like not having the parent you wanted. Or even, and like we're not even allowed to say this, not having the kid you wanted. You know? Like that's a kind of grief.
Sure.
To have parents who never really accepted you and understood you, like, and then you see other people, oh, I just had my Thanksgiving with my 50 family members. Like, that hurts.
Yeah.
You know? Like, so it is about that kind of grief, I think, more than the dad being dead type of grief.
Just the disappointment.
Yeah, and the feeling of having disappointed someone. I think what the realization Jay comes to sort of in the stomach is that Mitt might have been a bad father in a lot of ways, but all those lessons that he tried to teach him, the lessons that ultimately give him a chance to get out of the whale, were his way of showing love. It was a flawed way, but it was how he was trying to do it. It was the best he could do at the time with his limited emotional vocabulary, teaching his son how to survive on the water was him clumsily attempting to show love.
That's the only way he knew how to do it.
Yeah, and should he have tried harder? Of course, but that was evidence of love.
And there are these two sentences that you have in the last part of the book, maybe like the last 40 or 50 pages, that are related to that. And one of them is, no one carries the best parts of themselves. The best parts are those held inside of others. And the other is, Jay didn't find his dad's remains. He is his dad's remains.
Yeah, that might be the best two sentences I've ever written.
They're pretty good.
They're like, those are the kind of sentences that I didn't know. Like, they just came out of my fingers one day. And I was like, oh, he is his dad's remains. Ugh.
Yeah.
Crushing.
Man. Made a note, bold-faced it.
Yeah.
And decided that I was going to end this conversation with it. So I think that's a good note to end on, without really spoiling anything about the ending of the book, which you should read if you haven't already. But now we're going to open things up to the audience for questions. And then afterwards, I hope that you'll all join us for the book signing out in the lobby. So if anybody has a question, just raise your hand and we'll work around. We're getting a mic, but we'll start with you.
Probably here.
Yeah, I might be able to hear. Although there's a...
the recording.
Yeah.
So I listened to the book, which your narrator was phenomenal. And I have a question about how you figure out the cadence, because there was one point where I actually was driving home from campus, and I got to a point where I was having a hard time catching my breath, and then all of a sudden I literally said out loud, I don't know how much more of this I can take. And then it simmered down. So how do you know when too much is when it's done and you got to kind of back off?
Do you mean specifically for the audiobook?
Yeah. Well, I haven't read it. I bought the hardback right away.
Well, I don't know. I haven't heard the audiobook.
Oh my God.
I mean, I've heard, I cannot conceivably listen to my own books. That's not ever going to happen. I usually listen to like 20 seconds, just to get a flavor, like, okay. And usually they consult you about like which of these people do you like? And so I'll listen to the voices and give my 2 cents. That guy's Kirby Hayborn did that. He's done a lot of my books. So whenever I have a somewhat youthful sounding male, I often suggest Kirby because he's so good. And he has a youthful voice And he's probably done half my books. But beyond that, no idea. Like it's if there's a director, and sometimes there's not, sometimes just like the reader, but if there's a director, they will handle all that stuff. It certainly doesn't go into the calculation of how I'm writing. I don't ever think about the audiobook. Sometimes after I've written and it's time to get the audiobook, I start thinking about things in the book that are going to be challenging. Like I had a book, Scowler, that had these like long paragraphs of just nonsense, because it was like this kind of long story, but it had these long paragraphs of just nonsense. And I was like, is he really going to read all those nonsense words that are just a mashup of letters? He did. He read every single one of them, and it's amazing. But I would have thought, oh, that's going to be unlistenable, and instead it was like the coolest part of the book.
Any other questions?
Now that you're over the hurdle of the book is out and you've done all this research, do you ever find yourself correcting other people's crazy misconceptions about whales?
Is that John? Hey, great writer here. Yeah, I mean, usually the one that's always is like about once a year. There's always a headline: "Man swallowed by a whale and spit out by a whale." They're never swallowed. It ain't gonna happen. So that always annoys me. A lot of times people will tag me on things and they'll put a little whale emoji, and they always pick the wrong whale emoji. It's like, there's a sperm whale emoji, just not that one. So but generally people get things wrong all the time, but I'm sure I still do too. And they're not. I don't expect anyone to be whale experts, so it's all fine. No, they're allowed to make mistakes.
I'm sure it's like choosing a favorite child, but do you have a favorite book you've written, whether it was favorite to write or audience reaction?
It's kind of like it shifts. This is definitely up there. I really do like Whalefall, and I love my World War I book. It's not out yet, called Angel Down. But I often say, I did this one book for this crime imprint called Hard Case Crime, which is this really cool, hey, you have it. It's called Blood Sugar. Very, very weird little book. And I just love it. It is nothing like anything else I've ever written. I don't think it's much like anything ever written. Very weird book, and gonna not be for everyone, for sure. But it was just one of those books that I worked on for, it was like my little passion project between other bigger projects. Mm-hmm. And I could have just worked on it forever. I just had so much fun with that book. And whenever I see it, whenever someone shows up with it, I get really excited. So I'm gonna go with the big underdog, Blood Sugar.
Any other questions?
Can you talk a bit about growing into the life of a writer from building a creative life that, obviously you've made it, but starting from the iSchool and filmmaking and then writing, and when you knew that you could do this, and what your writing process is like?
Well, that's a lot. I'm gonna try to do a short version of that. I mean, to some extent, I think I thought I could do this when I was like in middle school, and then I sort of lost that confidence. But that's when I started writing. I mean, I started writing in first grade, but I was writing certainly novella-length things in middle school and novels in high school. And I would say that I think it was the single most important thing to my career as a writer was something I set up, a pattern that I set in middle school, which was I'd work on these things, and I don't feel like you almost couldn't do this today because there's so many ways to share your work now. Mm-hmm. I didn't share it with anyone. Like I would just write it and feel good about it, and I'd put it in the drawer, and that was it. Mm-hmm. And that really, I think, imprinted into my brain writing is something that I was doing that was really fun, and it was just something I like to do for me. And I was really absolutely divorced from any sort of reactions to it. And I'm largely still writing the same way. Where like the release of a book is, I wouldn't say it's an annoyance to me, but it's like, I'm the least interested in the release of a book. It's like,
You did it, it's done, it's out.
I just, like I know part of the job is to try to get people to buy it, and so I do events and stuff. But I really have very little interest in a book release. I just really like to write, and I generally don't read any reviews. I'm still sort of cut off from the larger response to a book. So when I finish a book, just like I did when I was a kid, and I turn in the book, to me it's like, I love this book. Usually when I turn in a book, it's because I think it's great. I love this book, and nothing can ever really damage that, because I'm not, I would never go on Goodreads or Amazon and like read reviews. That would just be, it sounds like a terrible idea. And so I'm still just sort of living in this like little happy castle where I'm just happy with all my stuff. And I think that's a really good way to work. As far as like my daily routine, that's just more, I've always kind of like, I'm like a factory worker. Like I'm very non-precious. I wanted to, and I think I have generally, fostered a career where I can write anywhere, at any time, whether it's at home, an airport, airplane, anywhere. And just clock in, get to writing first thing in the morning, and do a solid 8 hours of business. I write 6 days a week. And it's a struggle. For years, I worked 7 days a week, but I eventually was convinced to take off Sundays. But it's still a struggle. I would write every single day of the year and most nights if I could. I'm just very, very passionate about writing. It's my favorite. It's my job, and it's also my hobby. It's actually not healthy, honestly. And I know this is true. It's funny, but it's also true. Like, I love writing so much that it has been to some deficit of other life. Like, I've lost touch with people. I mean, it's just like I've got sort of tunnel vision in a way that is really good if you want to write a lot of books, but is, I need other hobbies.
Sure. It's not good for balance.
It isn't. And I need to get better about that.
Well, you've written a lot of books.
I have. I like them. Yeah.
So do other people. Any other questions? Okay. Well, I hope you all join us for the book signing out in the lobby. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.
Daniel Kraus, everybody.